a social work academic in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at Queen's University Belfast. In fact, today is my first year anniversary of taking up my appointment at Queen's, so it's a bit of an evening really. I'm the founder of Social Work Book Group. It's an approach in social work education that was designed largely to provide a context in which to explore the human condition and the sociological context of a lived experience. We've been going in Social Work Book Group for around 8 years now, and we've got through quite a lot of books in that time. Let me see, what began as 3 students in a library in a university in the north of England has now become an international community of learning for practice. And I should mention that we've got some long-standing book groupers with us here tonight. You'll see on the Twitter feed mostly Sue Gardner and Jen Seabright. And we've got Caroline Beswick, who will be moderating the chat and feeding questions into Dorothy and the panel. We've also got, as you just met, the fantastic QUB learning technologist, Laura Farling, who will manage all things tech. But so I'm really delighted to welcome colleagues from across the globe to Queen's University Belfast, in particular, Dorothy. It's a huge honour to have you at Queen's with us this evening, reading from your robustly researched and appropriately challenging text, Shattered Bonds. It's an honour too, also for the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work to be hosting this event. And I do trust that you've had an enjoyable pre-event foray around the campus in our virtual tours that we showed a moment ago, and had some time to soak in the lovely city that is Belfast. So I'm now going to over to my colleague, Ariane Critchley. And it was Dr. Critchley's, probably her fault as well as mine, that this all sort of kicked off over a tweet one evening where we came across 2 academics that we have great respect for, Rua Benjamin and obviously Dorothy Roberts. So I'll hand over to you, Ariane, to kick us off in terms of an introduction to the reason why we're really here this evening.
Thank you, Amanda, for that introduction, and welcome to everybody. Yeah, I'm not sure it's my fault, but it was a really interesting conversation that really Amanda and I got into around an event that I had attended that Dorothy Roberts and Rua Benjamin were talking at. So I'm going to say a little bit about how I came to Dorothy's work, what it means to me and my work, and why I think that this book and this event is so important for us in the UK in social work, before handing over to Beverly Barnett Jones, who will introduce Dorothy and say a bit herself about Shattered Bonds, which is fantastic. So I came to Dorothy's work not so much through Shattered Bonds, but through Killing the Black Body. This is another really important text, I think, for social work. And in that, Dorothy deals with the issue of race and reproductive justice. And because my doctoral work was concerning pre-birth child protection, there was an obvious kind of crossover there. And the women that I met through my research were experiencing just deep surveillance and scrutiny of their reproduction. And at the same time, I was working with birth mothers who were had had their children removed sometime previously. And they were still trying to find a way to be in the world and an identity that made sense of their motherhood, with their family separated in that way. And Shattered Bonds opens with the stories of Black women in Chicago that Dorothy had met. And I think that those stories are so important because they allow us to understand the depth of suffering of separated families. And I think that a lot of their experiences would be familiar to families in the UK. So what struck me apart from those stories, and I'm sure we'll talk about that this evening, but was the real robustness of Dorothy's line of argument through Shattered Bonds. And I feel like this book is a real gift to those of us who are working in applied disciplines like social work, because often we're kind of wrestling with the intuition that some of the ways that we're working, the system that we're involved in, is in some way not aligned to our values or how we want to work with families. And I think that Dorothy really shows us how that comes about in relation to race and poverty, and really shows us how that can create a harm, not just for individuals, but for groups. So there are lots of moving parts in the UK right now in terms of child poverty, white privilege, and the past and ongoing harms of the kind of concept of empire. And our problems, I think, in facing up to these in society generally and in social work. So I think we have a kind of really a lot of problems to address in terms of the Child Protection Project, and those can feel really overwhelming. So I really want to thank Dorothy for the contribution of your work and what that can help us do in terms of addressing those problems, I think. And I also really want to just acknowledge the fact that you were calling this out 20 years ago as a really brilliant Black professor. And I think it's really interesting that it takes us this long sometimes to listen. So my view from a research perspective is that we need to acknowledge and build on the work you've done and to better understand how racism and other inequalities are creating problems for families, and that Black families really deserve safety and freedom in all our societies, and they're not experiencing those basic rights. So I really hope that this event can be another small step towards that urgent goal. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Beverly Barnett Jones to say a little bit about what this book and event have meant for her, why she agreed to get on board with us, and she'll introduce Dorothy to you all. Thank you.
Beverly, sorry, I think you're still on mute. Sorry.
I'm on mute. There we go. First technical failure. I was on mute. Apologies. I just want to follow on and echo the words of Ariane in terms of what she's laid out for us for the events tonight. I was happily over enthusiastically happy actually to join the event because it's an area that I spent my life in terms of my practice as a social worker for coming to 30 years this year. And obviously it's a research interest for me in terms of my role as a person thinking about practice and impact and systems change. And I've worked alongside researchers who've been looking at this area. I reached out to Ariane a few years ago now when she was completing her dissertation up in Edinburgh and was having an exchange with her about the work she was doing because it was a big area of interest for me. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Dorothy. She is a hero for me. Don't want to embarrass her, but she is. And we have to have them because we have so few, so we grab them wherever they are. So I'm so delighted that you're here tonight with this massive global audience, that we've got some really wonderful people that have taken time to be with us tonight. I came to Shattered Bonds similarly to in the way that Ariane described through your work on reproductive justice. And also now I'm trying to deepen my understanding around race technology through your work and the work of Rory Benjamin also. In my view, it's all connected, and that's where I stand. I just want to just kind of reflect that the fact is that Dorothy 20 years ago knew that the story of her child was not hers alone. We are struck by and appreciate the voices of lived experience of the hurt and pain and the struggle for rights, families fighting for the right to belong and dignity. 20 years ago, Dorothy wrote this book and she joined meticulous academic research with a prejudice of these narratives of the excluded. And I think she saw a light and used her gifts and I think obvious love in the way that she writes about the families and writes about the passion in her area, and opened to me the door on a system which was then and is actually now in effect carceral. It's a system that imprisons and traps families not only as individuals but as whole groups and classes of people. And it shouldn't be surprising that we find something so painful when we think about the American dream and the continued colonisation, the othering and rendering of people. It's what drives systemic racism and classist systems of so-called care. And Dorothy's book is so detailed in the analysis of that time, and it's frighteningly prescient for our current times. And I echo again what Ariane identified for us. I was asked to give a bit of reflection about this in terms of myself. I think as a Black professional, we've not much presence, but some presence, because I'm typical of a Black professional. I tend to hide myself behind. That's often what we do, but not at the moment. I'm out there in the front trying to articulate and talk about these issues to wherever I can find. Obviously, you know, there's an examination going on within the UK because of the mass uprisings we've seen around the world, articulated in movements such as Black Lives Matters. And tonight we're really concerned with the response of social work as it operates essential to our care, welfare and justice systems. I thought about this a bit, and I think there is maybe a false sense of comfort in the UK when you read the Shattered Bonds that we're not as bad as the US, because there are obviously some serious stories to be told and continued stories. I want to say that we're not the same as the US, of course. It is different, but in some ways it's worse here, because my experience of how racism and oppression operates is that you do have the expertise of the British Empire system, and its imperial mission was to create a wonderful, clever system of divide and rule, stratifying colour and rewarding types of racial groups rather than others. It's very good at co-opting the acceptable voices that purport to be representative. And in a sense, I see that now, because even though we're moving through our response to Black Lives Matters, you see a division being played out between those who are considered to be wanting to be the abolitionists and those who are the reformers. This kind of division just means that a lot of energy gets dissipated rather than coalescing and collaborating around the change agenda. And while we get into some of those spaces, the worm of the system still turns. I think in respect to Ariane's point, we have to think in terms of intersection, and we know that the role class and poverty plays in both our public and private family justice systems. We know that deprivation and poverty are real drivers that open families to a surveillance and a policing. That's very different if you are privileged. That is until, of course, you sometimes hit the system and you are shocked by its toxic effects. And I know that because as I operate as a children's guardian and came across the odd middle-class, well-to-do family, they were often in a state of shock at how brutal and how difficult it is to work your way through a family justice system. I think it's very important that at this moment we are really understanding the potency of it. I'm not sure quite yet if we've got that in the UK. I think ideas around promoting anti-racist responses, promoting Black academia and scholarship in our field, all of these are to be welcomed. We do need good data. We don't have good population data about race and ethnicity. That's one of the things that I'm dealing with in the work that I'm doing. We know we have very poor data, so it's hard to get those real granular ideas around how the system is functioning. We can see the power of good data in terms of the work that Dorothy puts forward as a real way of challenging the existing systems. But I think for us as social workers, we have to understand that there's a crisis of legitimacy across the world, really, around the institutions of law and governance, coming from both the right and left, and to recognise that many families and allies are no longer accepting the way the systems work and what our role is as social workers within it. For my penny's worth, it's always about social justice. Place-based, diverse sets of responses is how we move the system to change. I've always known that my Black life matters. So for me tonight, you're all welcome to come on a journey in allyship with the humility we as social work professionals must have if we are to be trusted to work with and be with our communities. Communities that often welcome help, care and support, but we must define and lead the nature of that help. Family and community, in my view, must always be in a driving seat. I just want to take a couple of minutes to introduce our wonderful guest tonight, Professor Dorothy E. Roberts. I love the E when I see it. Dorothy is an internationally recognised scholar, public intellectual and social justice advocate, studying and writing about the interplay of gender, race and class in legal issues, and has been a leader in transforming public thinking and policy on reproductive health, child welfare and bioethics. Dorothy is Professor of Africana Studies, Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dorothy directs the Penn Programme on Race, Science and Society. She has authored and co-edited 10 books, including the award-winning Killing the Black Body and Shattered Bonds. And her latest book, Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. She received in 2015 the Solomon Carter Fuller Award from the American Psychiatric Association for providing significant benefit for the quality of the life of Black people. Without any further noise for myself, I want to hand us over to the beautiful Dorothy.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, wonderful. Well, I'm just so excited to be with all of you this afternoon here in Philadelphia. I was just ecstatic to get the invitation to learn about your group. So impressed with the work that you're doing all across the UK and the connections that you've made. And I've just enjoyed engaging with you over the many months that we've been pulling this together. So thanks to all of you involved. I'm afraid I'll miss somebody, so I'm not going to mention all the names, but thanks to everyone involved, and special thanks to Ariane and Beverly for those wonderful introductions. So I was asked to begin with a reading from Shattered Bonds. And, I combed the book to figure out what would be the best passages to read. And I decided to just start from the beginning because it is a kind of concise summary of my objectives in the book. And it tells the story about some of the Black mothers in Chicago I met with and spent time with to understand better what I'm now calling a family policing system in Chicago. And by the way, of course, my neighbor decided to do lawn mowing right now. So I don't know if you get, but literally the minute I turned on my microphone, there's some major lawn thing going on next door. But so I'm sorry if that interrupts. But okay, so I named titled the introduction, Facing the Racial Reality of Child Welfare. And of course, we'll have time for discussion. So any aspect of the book you want to discuss, please just send in your questions. I'll be happy to discuss any aspect of Shattered Bonds with you as well. Okay, so Facing the Racial Reality of Child Welfare. One summer evening, I drove to St. Stephen's Church in Englewood, one of Chicago's poorest neighborhoods, to attend a meeting of Black mothers whose children had been taken by the State Child Protection Agency. They called their organization Operation Moses, for Mothers Organizing Systems for Equal Services. A boy playing outside directed me to the church basement, where I found a half-dozen women sitting around a table. The women were strategizing about a citywide campaign to call attention to the crisis of children being removed from their homes. They greeted me warmly, grateful to have the ear of a sympathetic law professor. At one end of the table was an expanding file stuffed with court papers, newspaper clippings, and letters. They sat me at the other end so that I could face everyone. Each woman told me about her battle with the child welfare system to get her children back. Jornell, the group's founder, lost custody of her 1-month-old baby when hospital staff reported her for medical abuse. This is the fourth year in foster care, his fourth year in foster care. Valerie relinquished custody of her 3 children to the Child Protection Agency when she was living in a cold, roach-infested apartment and had no means to support them. She had told authorities that she wanted them back in 6 months, but the agency moved ahead with termination of her parental rights. Devon had cared for her 4 nieces and nephews since they were toddlers, devoting herself to meeting their special medical and educational needs. She had seen them only twice since they were taken from her more than a year earlier because her apartment was too small. These women's stories reflect the color of the U.S. child welfare system today. More, and that again, 20 years ago, but also today, 20 years later. More than 500,000 children taken from their parents are currently in foster care, and it's still about the same in the United States. African Americans are the most likely of any group to be disrupted in this way by government authorities. Black children make up nearly half of the foster care population, although they can constitute less than 1/5 of the nation's children. Now today, it's the disparity isn't as great, but it's still a huge disparity, overrepresentation of Black children in the child welfare system. In Chicago, and this figure is probably the same, 95% of children in foster care are Black. So it's basically a system for Black children in the city of Chicago. Once removed from their homes, Black children remain in foster care longer, are moved more often, receive fewer services, and are less likely to be either returned home or adopted than other children. The child welfare system is the focus of intense public scrutiny, condemned by conservatives and liberals alike. Everyone agrees that foster care is overburdened and often damages children more than raising them in either their birth families or adoptive homes. However, the public debate has failed to examine why Black children are removed from their parents in such large numbers, or what the consequences are for Black families and communities. Public sentiment and policy have chosen to focus instead on solving foster care's problems by encouraging the adoption of more children. The number of Black children in state custody, those in foster care, as well as those in juvenile detention, prisons, and other state institutions, is a startling injustice that calls for radical reform. I would call it the system's ugly secret, except that it should be obvious to anyone who has spent a day examining the statistics, visiting a child welfare office, or watching who goes in and out of juvenile court. The fact that the system, supposedly designed to protect children, remains one of the most segregated institutions in the country should arouse our suspicion. And if I just can make a little comment about that, I was totally shocked when I found out these statistics while I was working on Killing the Black Body, and I thought, why isn't this a national outrage? You can't have missed it. You couldn't work in Chicago and not notice that every single family virtually before the court was a Black family. And in the United States, at least, probably in other parts of the world as well, white-dominated state institutions that include mostly Black people are not good institutions, right? In the US, the best goes to white citizens. So it's suspicious to find an institution that has mostly Black people. Yet most contemporary critiques of the child welfare system barely acknowledge the importance of race. Scholars who deal with Black children in the child welfare system tend to focus on social work practice, how children should be treated, rather than the politics of child protection, how political relationships affect which children become involved in the system. Their primary goal is to make services more sensitive to the needs and culture of Black families, not to question the fundamental conflict between the child welfare system and the integrity of Black families and communities. Child protection authorities are taking custody of Black children at alarming rates, and in doing so, they're dismantling social networks that are critical to Black community welfare. This book answers 3 questions that correspond to its main parts. Why are so many Black children removed from their homes and placed under state supervision? How will the current politics of child welfare affect the system's racial imbalance? And why should we be concerned about the racial disparity in the child welfare system? I conclude by proposing steps that we can take to transform the system toward respecting the integrity of Black families while addressing the deprivation in many homes. Shattered Bonds is a plea to call the child welfare system what it is, a state-run program that disrupts, restructures, and polices Black families. I hope to capture the injustice of a system that separates thousands of Black children from their parents every year and relegates them to damaging state institutions. There is little evidence that the foster care system has improved the well-being of Black children, and much evidence that it supports the disadvantaged position of Black people as a whole. The truth is that many Black parents fight desperately against a wealthy and powerful system to regain their children. They are often worn down by pointless and burdensome requirements, insidious financial incentives, and racial bias. I want to provide the missing voice of Black families torn apart by discriminatory and misguided policies. Some people think that the best way to help thousands of Black children in foster care is to terminate their parents' rights and place them in adoptive homes. These people do not see themselves as racists who are bent on destroying Black families. They may even endorse stronger social support programs for American struggling families, but they do believe Child Protective Services must intervene immediately to save Black children from their current crisis. These children can't wait for social problems to eliminate poverty and racism, these advocates argue. We must act now to move them from their destructive families and neighborhoods into stable homes. I hope this book demonstrates that this new cadre of child savers are wrong. 100 years from now, today's child welfare system will surely be condemned as a racist institution, one that compounded the efforts of discrimination on Black families by taking children from their parents, allowing them to languish in a damaging foster care system or to be adopted by more privileged people. School children will marvel that so many scholars and politicians defended this devastation of Black families in the name of protecting Black children. The color of America's child welfare system is the reason Americans have tolerated its destructiveness. It is also the most powerful reason to finally abolish what we now call child protection and replace it with a system that really promotes children's welfare. So I'll close there. And when I read that over, I was happy to see that I said abolished it back 20 years ago, before I was really involved in an abolition movement. And it was just interesting that I used that word. So I had the sense that that's what we needed even before I had engaged in a really abolitionist analysis of the child welfare system or the prison system or policing. But I'm happy to take questions and engage in a conversation and discussion about this issue in the United States and in the UK and other parts of the world.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, for that reading. That was fantastic, really very powerful. And it's such a powerful opening of the book. And as you say, you go on to really lay out step by step what you promise, I think, in the introduction. So Amanda has posted a question for all of our readers. So I hope that people will start to respond to that. I suppose coming back to what you were saying there about you know, the way that your work has developed over the last 2 decades, whether, you know, do you feel that your position has shifted since what you wrote at the end of Shattered Bonds, or is it the same? And would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, I would love to, because I'm actually currently writing a new book on making a case for abolishing the family policing system in the United States. And so it arose from a request that I write a preface to an anniversary edition, a 20th anniversary edition of Shattered Bonds. And when I talked to my editor about it, and he said, well, what would you put in the preface? I went on for about an hour, and he said, well, you need to write a new book then, you know. And so I have been thinking a lot about where I've come in the last 20 years. So just a little bit about what I've been doing and what it's led me to. So after writing Shattered Bonds, it along with other concerns about the racial disparities in child welfare in the United States, generated reform efforts. I was asked to be involved with foundations, with government agencies. I served for 9 years on a class action settlement agreement in Washington State all these efforts to try to reduce disproportionality. It now had a name, disproportionality in the child welfare system, or to improve it in some way. And I became very frustrated with those government and foundation efforts because they primarily focused on making foster care a little bit better, mainly by training foster parents better, listening to foster parents, sometimes listening to children who've been and youth who've been in foster care, but rarely, if ever, really taking parents' views into account, and certainly not giving them any authority to, to make any changes. And at the same time, I was becoming more involved with mainly Black mothers organizing. So Operation Moses that I described was really a kind of ragtag group of mothers who had kids in foster care who didn't have the resources and the clout to influence policy. It really was more of a support group, an information sharing group, but they didn't have any influence over child welfare policy at all. And it was very clear that there was a need to support organizing. And that has happened a lot more over the last 20 years. So I would describe those 20 years as being involved in sort of official reform efforts and also being involved in organizing by parents, some litigation efforts as well. And because a big part of reform is, which I think is very important, is giving parents better representation in court. So that was an effort I've been involved in as well. And then I would say the other is getting more knowledgeable, informed, and involved about prison and policing abolition and the ideas, the ideas and the organizing and the strategies and the history of abolition movements has greatly informed my thoughts about what to do about family policing in the United States. So all of those combined, I think have led me to the point I'm at today, where I think that reform efforts are not only inadequate, but often harmful. That doesn't mean that, I really feel very strongly about what Beverly said. That doesn't mean that we should see ourselves as abolitionists versus reformers and end up weakening our efforts. But I do think that any reform efforts should be directed toward abolition. If the reform efforts are going to simply obscure the problems in the current system, legitimize them, at least in the US, which is the one I'm familiar with, then they're not going to work. There will be 20 years from now having the exact same discussion. So I think we need to strategize about reforms that will move us toward abolishing the system we have now, which means abolishing the very logics it's based on. The system we have now is based on accusing parents, monitoring parents, getting agents, both official and unofficial, to turn parents in, investigate them, and threaten to take their children away from them or take their children away from them. Everything is based on that. And that is not a supportive, caring, non-oppressive, freedom-enhancing way of thinking about child welfare. It doesn't support child welfare. So as long as the system is based on that, which it still is, reducing the number of children in foster care is not the same thing as ending foster care as the service that you provide to families. So, so I'm much clearer now on what I meant at the end of the introduction, what abolition means, and advocating very strongly for that and thinking more strategically about what kinds of reforms and other changes. And the other thing I would say is just at the end of that sentence, the part I would change where I call for abolition of what we now call child protection, I said, and replace it with a system that really promotes children's welfare. Well, I'm now clearer that just modifying this system and replacing it with another modified system is not the answer. The answer is radical change in our society that will negate the very concept of taking children away as the way to address families' needs. So a new system that addresses the needs of families isn't going to solve this. We need a radically different way of addressing human needs in our societies that don't require creating a child welfare system because we failed to do that. So the system we have now is based on the failure to take care of families. No, we shouldn't base the system on the failure to do that. We should have a society that doesn't fail at it. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's a major difference in my views as well. But a lot of what I wrote in Shattered Bonds, I stick with. I think is still true today. In fact, one of my challenges is when I go back and read what I read, I just want to repeat it in the new book. And it's like, what? Like I've had introduction. I can't replicate today that experience I had walking into that basement with those mothers. And I want to tell that story again. So I don't know if it may be offline, if any of you have suggestions for how you incorporate your past work into new work without just quoting yourself over and over again. I would appreciate it. But so that's a great question again that I'm grappling with, literally every day now as I write this new book.
Thank you. I think that, yeah, that definitely answers the question. I think as I'm going to hand over to Amanda to ask some questions from the group, but I think I just feel myself so challenged by the ideas, and I think like as a practitioner, we have to make so much of a mind shift, don't we, in a way from the idea of like, if we're not doing this, we're not protecting children. And so I'm going to stop talking. Thank you.
I think the structural problems, Ariane, you bring up are they're quite they're vast, isn't it? There's a real structural problem that we need to think about in terms of being part of the solution rather than supporting the problem. Really, I think that's something that's a challenge for social work today across the world, that we need to think about or rethink what we're about and push back on some of those structural issues. But they are quite big. But hopefully, this is the start of some of our pushback, some of our activism around this. Dorothy, I'm going to hand over to Caroline Bezic, who is moderating the chat, and Caroline's going to go through some of the, hopefully she can hear me, go through some of the comments that have been made and some of the maybe questions.
Yeah, hi, everybody. So I would say, Dorothy, probably reflecting Ariane's initial response, that the chat is sort of heavily populated with people quite shocked that this is a book and an account from 20 years ago, and actually it could be from today. So I think the overwhelming feeling is one of shocked in some respects, although, you know, others saying, you know, it's happening in plain sight. We do know that this is going on today. So actually some of the questions that are coming up in the chat, you answered with your response there, in terms of, you know, a little bit more about the specific barriers and you know, what you're suggesting as a response, and this kind of idea of reform versus abolition in some of those contexts. But something else that came out in the reflections was this idea again of, and something that came out in your opening reading, Dorothy, around the book being about, you know, giving a voice, you know, these missing voices. So giving a voice to these families. Beverly, in your introduction, you talked about the fact that we simply we don't have enough data for one thing, in terms of actually, you know, being able to quantify and fully understand the position. So maybe some thoughts from across the panel, really, in terms of how do we learn from that 20 years, not end up in, you know, this sort of reflection, you know, again in a further 20 years, but in particular make sure that lived experiences and the voices of these families are central to some of this movement for reform and/or abolition. So I don't know if, you know, I suppose open to, you know, yourself, Dorothy, Bev, Ariane, to maybe have some comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in there because I think this is sort of the sole purpose of my existence at the moment. I think it will be what I go out with my feet up, hopefully by the time I'm 80, because I've finally got to a space where we can actually start to really try to talk openly and take this away from being understand that it's in plain sight and put the light on it. I think for me, you know, I look at what's happening in the US, I look at what's happening in New Zealand and Australia, and I see the power of the lived experience. I see the power of the families and community action and organisation, and I see the importance of professionals really being brave and taking a brave step to ally themselves and work with and understand the meaning of those experiences as evidence about what the system does and how the system needs to be something very different. On the other side of it, we have a situation here where we've had a history of not collecting data about all sorts of families, because the people that are the data collection are not interested in those families and their stories. So historically, we've got a problem I can only talk about perhaps my role in terms of England and Wales, but I'm sure it's replicated in all of our nations, that the population study and the population evidence that you're able to pull, Dorothy, we just don't have that good enough here, and that's been identified in terms of the work that I'm doing at the Family Justice Observatory, which is going to those organisations, the government, where the levers are, and to say you need to improve this, you need to actually structurally do something about the collection of data as a starting point, because for us to be able to move on to really being able to describe what are the impacts of the system and impacts of policy and practices on families, we need the information to be collected. We have really patchy information about ethnicity, we have really patchy information about fathers, because some of the data sets are just about the mother's journey, they don't capture the father's journey. So one of the questions I immediately raised within my work was, you know, how can we call these population studies when we're not actually addressing the needs of significant bits of the population? You know, that's a kind of obvious statement, but one had to make it. But I think there is a world of learning for us here as social workers, because I go back to that statement I made about legitimacy. Because when I came into social work practice, and I'm happy to share my story a little bit, I came into it for experience of actually being removed from my family in the 1970s and having to spend time in what was a deeply racist and deeply abusive care system. And we've got many reviews and reports that told us about what care was in the 70s, in the 80s and in the 90s. And although I won't in any way say that care is as it was, it is still not care, because those who have lived experience and care experience tell you, and the evidence that we do have about outcomes and the lifelong outcomes for young people going through a care system is that on average, you know, they're dying 20 years earlier than everybody else, for example, you know, so there's real functional problems. And it's hard for us as social workers when we're growing up in a system that's moved from the idea of community social work, you know, living in the era living in the space where families are experiencing the real challenges of structural inequalities, real challenges of poverty, to a world that became about child rescue, and this idea that we're there to rescue and save children, that became the dominant ideology. And I think, as Amanda says, this is a time for us to really sit back and critically kind of think, well, actually, the challenge that we're experiencing and trying to compartmentalise it into, oh, it's a response about racism. Let's just improve the way we respond to racism and just forget the whole intersectional picture, the whole journey and the function of this system will be a mistake. So I think that's where, for me, I would say to my colleagues on the channels tonight that we need to think about the systemic and the systems responses. And we have a movement growing in these nations that is being led by parents, led by young people, led by experience-led organisations, learning from our colleagues in the US about how we need to seriously look at the movement to a different kind of child welfare. That's what I would call it. What is child welfare? A different focus on how do we look after families and strengthen families. Because there isn't a social worker that won't say to you that at the moment that they're acting, they believe, and we believe we are doing something that's virtuous. There are always people that are not very helpful in a system, and they can be abusive practitioners. But it's a system that creates those contexts, and it's a culture of practice that creates those contexts. And I think for us, we have to really enable social workers, those of us that are old farts like myself, been at it for years, and those who are coming through and been educated by these fantastic colleagues I've got on the panel tonight. How do we open up that thinking for them about their legitimacy? Who is the person that signs of your capacity? It's not the law, it's not the regulations, it's families and communities that give you your legitimacy. And if they're saying we no longer can deal with this and we won't take it anymore, that's a crisis for us, and we've got to really deeply look about what do we go back to say to our regulators and our people that control our professional practice. Because a lot of the debate has been about that space around what is social work, what is its function, and we are regulated through a state-funded organisation, and we call ourselves a profession. There's loads of questions there for me, which I'll stop now, but those are some of the things I think I would really put out there to our audience to think about.
Yeah, no, I think there's so many good points you've made there, Beverly. Yeah, there's so much in that. I think that one of the things I really like about Shattered Bonds is the way that it's an argument about structural racism, isn't it? And it's about, this isn't about, there's so much of the work we've done in social work has been about practitioners and how can practitioners be anti-racist or non-oppressive. And that's so important in terms of social work education. But there's all these things that we could be as non-oppressive as we want, but if we're working in an oppressive system, then that's still a problem. So yeah, no, I think that's some really good points. I don't know if I don't want to stop Dorothy coming in there and maybe joining that conversation.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot to respond to. Thank you for those comments, Beverly. And picking up on what you said, Ariane, I think that's absolutely right, that it is the structure, the racist structure of the system, the design of the system that leads to these outcomes. It's not about the motivations of people within it, although I have to say that there is evidence, of racial bias on the part of individual social workers and others in the system, sometimes, but again, based on systemic ideas that have been passed down, for decades, if not centuries, about the dysfunction of Black families. I think, and the lack of value for these families and their bonds. I mean, a big part of, I think, why these families can be separated both by the people in the system, but also why the public isn't outraged by it, is because there's this view that their family relationships don't matter that much. I mean, I've definitely heard this either explicitly or subtly in so many meetings and conferences I've been in, that Black children are better off anywhere except with their parents. So, this is why it's possible for a lot of people to think they're helping Black families, they're helping Black communities, they're helping Black children by taking these children out of their communities. And they really seem to genuinely believe this is good. Well, there was just an article published in a journal maybe 2 weeks ago by a group of researchers. A couple of them are colleagues at Penn, who said, well, it's all because of efforts to get services to these children. Now, we hear this over and over again. Black children need these services, so we're just helping them. And also the idea that, well, they already, have been damaged in their community, so the damage that we see at the end is not because of the system. And this is a point I'm trying to emphasize in my new book, is that no, the system is structured in a way to produce these harms. And so in a way, it's not only because of individual actions, and we can't look at it that way. But on the other hand, it is important, I think, as you just said, Ariane, for anybody involved in family policing, including social workers, to be anti-racist and to figure out what your role is going to be in this structure. I think it's so important for social workers to speak out and to help strategize what to do about the fact that these systems are structured in racist ways. The other comment I would make is, as I was reading the introduction, I was thinking that I wrote this 20 years ago, and in a way, I feel as if I wrote it at a point where you all are right now in the UK. Because when I wrote it, there weren't a lot of efforts to document and address the racial disparities. That there were government statistics which I cited, but not a lot of attention paid to them. And I think that it's important in the UK to get the data, as Beverly's saying, and deliberately think about how are we going to address this. I would say, though, that, I think Beverly indicated that, saying, I hope, I'm still standing when we do something about this. But just having the data, as the US case shows, isn't enough, because we've got tons of racial data on everything, and we know that Black people are at far higher rates of being, profiled by the police, wrongfully convicted, put in jail, put in prison, kids taken away from them, worst, lowest quality school, every single, higher rates of COVID, we've got all of this. And yet what happens is, for people who want to maintain the status quo, they simply come up with new explanations and justifications for why those disparities exist. And in fact, they can come up with very racist explanations, including biological explanations for why those disparities exist, and cultural explanations, for why the disparities exist. Or even, as I just laid out, these child-saving liberal explanations for what to do about the disparities. So you really have to be careful, and now you have the advantage of seeing what happened in the United States to say, we need the data, and we're not going to do what they did in the US and simply excuse it away, or whittle away at it a little bit and end up 20 years later with basically the same system.
Dorothy, can I just reflect to your question here from Claudia Bernard?
Sure.
About how has social workers in the US responded to the ideas put forward in your book?
Yeah, so they have, and I was reflecting on how in the past I've been more engaged with the National Black Social Worker Association than I have currently. So it's been, there have been various kinds of responses, and some more willing to radically address what I raise in the book, and others that have come up with milder ways of, not really addressing it, and others who have been defensive about it. And so I would say it's a range of ways. I would really like to see in the US and everywhere more of an effort by social workers and parent organizers to work together, including social workers also who are involved in other abolitionist movements. So I think we're at a point now in the US where it's really important, and this is something, going back to Ariane, your first question about some things that have changed. One thing is thinking more about how the prison and policing abolition movement can be coordinated with a family policing abolition movement that's also coordinated with social workers, in both of those movements. And that's something I haven't seen so far that I think is part of the next step of organizing around this issue.
Caroline, would you like to jump in with, I know there's a number of comments and some questions.
Yeah, we've got a lot around the child rescue actually, and the narrative around child rescue driving this movement of young children into adoption. And we have had the policy turn here around adoption being a panacea for so-called individualistic family-based problems, and there are still real complexities there around how adoptions operate in different sites. And also, I want to just comment, when I was thinking about tonight, I had a little look around what the work that's going on around school exclusions in England and Wales, which is children who are being expelled temporarily or permanently. And we've got some very, in that sense, it can give us a real mirror into what we don't know about child welfare, which is we see serious overrepresentation of particular racial groups, and we see, in terms of white families, and Gypsies and Romas are classified under the white category in the UK. You see a significant overrepresentation of Gypsy travelling families that are living differently, and they are a real story around how the system polices. And we have this administration of social work administrating immigration policies, which are about delegitimising the citizenship rights of children and their parents. Or the offer is sometimes, well, we'll take the child into care because that's a child in need, but we're not going to support the family because they have no recourse to what's called public funds here. So, there is a real crisis for social work, I think, around some of the things we've been asked to do in terms of public policy and how we respond to those. But I think there's been quite a lot of comment here about the child rescue, about that narrative. And I think one or two younger social workers slightly despairing about their experience and the hopes of social work and then what's actually happened in terms of practice. So I just want to offer a great story of hope, which is there's a woman on this stream, I believe, called Becca Dove, who is a fantastic practitioner in the London Borough of Camden, who is doing beautiful work around community and community action, lived experience, leadership. And I always suggest that if people just want that fillip as they go through some of the challenges, find those activities and find those activists, because they are there doing great allyship work around, completely rebooting and changing the system. So I just want to put that out there, because I have read about 2 or 3 messages from some newer younger social workers slightly despairing about the hopes and dreams of what's actually happened when they've gone into the practice front, and but hang in there and maintain those clear moral principles that you've got, because you know, the time is now, and it is about the urgency of now, as a very famous person said to us, as well as the fact that we do need to get that hard data and use that research and to really drive forward what a new system could look like.
It reminds me too of Yadviga Lee's work on New Beginnings and her doctoral work about challenging structures and systems.
Absolutely.
And, you know, as an insider researcher, reflecting back to the system, you know, as being part of the problem, really. And the work she's done around New Beginnings and parents and in their kind of that response to them, which is intense, but also it raises questions about how much energy we're going to put into this change, because this, what we're talking about here, requires a huge amount of energy. And the thing that should unite us, and you mentioned this earlier, is you know, a lot of our opinions seem to divide us rather than unite us in terms of the richness and diversity of the opinions that we hold, the knowledge we have, and how we use that kind of power we have. But yeah, so really, you know, these things are all connecting together for us. But again, it keeps bringing back to how do we affect change. And I have noticed some students commenting about, you know, this is not what I want, this is not what I subscribe to. Ariane, I guess as social work academics, we need to really pay attention to that in terms of the curriculum. You know, and this is, you know, this book for me has been, you know, this needs to be on a reading list. We need to be, it may be 20 years ago, but there's an energy and a reflection in this book that is relevant to now as everyone keeps reflecting back into the space. Just certainly something we need to take away from this.
Yeah. Well, you both raised a lot of ideas. If I could just respond to a few of them. So one is the child-saving adoption theme that runs across so much policy. As I describe in Shattered Bonds in 1997, right after the law that Congress passed in the U.S. abolishing the federal entitlement to welfare. The following year, Congress passed the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which speeds up termination of parental rights and incentivizes adoption. And I think it's interesting to note that both of those laws were signed by President Clinton, you know, not Trump or Reagan. So they're again, liberal child savers can be just as dangerous as some of the conservative views on this. In fact, the politics fall out in a really interesting way in the United States, because there are some conservatives who don't like big government. And so they don't like the idea that there is this powerful child welfare system that can come in and take your kids away from you. And they have formed certain parent rights groups as well. Now, I don't collaborate with them and I don't agree with their politics, but I'm just pointing out that they have certain policy efforts that are more in line with abolishing the child welfare system than certain liberal policy efforts. We shouldn't accept either one, you know, I think, but again, you have to be politically astute and realize what abolition truly means. It doesn't just mean eliminating a system and replacing it with another one. It means radically transforming society. And as Beverly was saying, the very meaning of what child welfare is and how to achieve it. But that the promotion of adoption is one of those liberal approaches that has been pitted against keeping families together. And in fact, there was this language of freeing Black children from their parents. There's just that language of freeing them that was very routinely used so that they could be adopted, disparages Black families and really twists the politics of power, you know, that's going on in these situations. The other point I would make for those who are despairing is the importance of solidarity and collective action, like this reading group. Because you cannot, if you, especially as a junior person coming into this profession or any profession, if you try to make changes, you're going to get fired. You're going to get fired. The supervisors. I mean, I've heard from so many social workers in the U.S. who say, well, I tried to get the family heat instead of taking their children away, and my supervisor wouldn't let me do it, and so it's only with collective action that change can happen. Again, not saying that you shouldn't be self-reflecting and to make a commitment to be anti-racist, but to change something as fundamental and powerful as the family policing system. You have to do it in solidarity and allyship with others. And so I really applaud this group as being one example of that, and to think about ways that social workers can organize collectively to figure out what to do, and then to have a stronger voice to take action is really important. So I will, those are my reflections. I don't know if there were other questions or reflections that came through the chat.
I've got one for you, Dorothy, and I know we're going over our time, I think, Amanda, but I know we started a bit late, which is often when we're dealing with these, kind of higher level objectives, as one might say, this kind of dream that we do, and then we get down to the granular. And some of the resistance is around, and we've got organisations, and very important organisations, and historically in this country that have been part of that child welfare system around, managing the poor and policing the poor is what I would call it. Oh. But also this idea about how we need to look after and care, a sort of moral compass around care and a community that cares. Yeah. But at the same time, the question always comes back to me, which is, but what do you do about people that abuse their children, Bev? You're going to let people abuse their children. You're going to let child protection and kids are going to get hurt, and you're just going to ignore it. So this is, you kind of say to people, that's preposterous. Of course we're not. How do you respond to that, Dorothy, in terms of that kind of challenge? Yeah.
So here's an area where I've learned a lot from prison abolitionists, because they get and policing abolitionists, they get the same kind of question. Well, what do we do about the criminals? What do we do about violent people? What do we do about domestic violence? So one response is, well, I don't want to say it as one response, but part of the response, the perspective is, first of all, to point out that this is not a system designed to improve children's welfare. I think sometimes history helps, thinking about the logics of it help. So we're not asking not to address families' needs, not to address harm in families. We're saying the way we're doing it now isn't even designed to do that. So why should we stay with an approach that we know is designed to police and punish? It's not designed. If it were designed to improve children's welfare, again, we wouldn't find these disproportionate numbers of the most marginalized people in it. So that's one basic idea, is nobody is saying don't care about children and families. We're saying, what is a better way to do it? Because what we have now is failing. So it's not only not designed to really care for children and families, it's failing at it. So,
some of the research we've published recently from one of our big data partners in the organisation, picked up something which came through to me in Shattered Bonds around, the issue of what stress and impact on mental well-being around stress, and how that can produce behaviours that nobody really wants to have happening, but they happen because of that. And one of the things we picked up on this piece of work we did, which was looking at 1,000 mothers entering what we call our care proceedings here in our lovely country of Wales. They would clearly define the strongest statement out of that this is a mental health crisis for families. It's not, as well as maybe a crisis of parenting, it's a crisis of mental health, and those systems around mental health being completely inadequate to meet the needs of these specific families. So the generalised population that offers you a prescription or a pill around depression, but isn't dealing with, you know, trauma of your life, maybe as a young person, but also the trauma of living in violent spaces, and why violent spaces and community spaces. There's a reason why we are developing these new kind of ideas around contextual safeguarding and extrafamilial harm, but they're antecedent, you know, families that have not been supported for years, communities that have not been supported for years, and people who are suffering significant mental health issues, you know, and that really came out very strongly in that piece of research that we recently published.
Yeah, so there's those kinds of issues that aren't being addressed. In the US, most cases of child abuse and neglect, or I should say child maltreatment, allegations of it, reasons for why families are investigated, and removal of children have to do with neglect, which almost always is related to poverty. It's that the material needs of families aren't being met, and then the parents are blamed for it, and the solution is take the children away. And sometimes what the parents have to do to get their children back is unrelated to the material, you know, issues to begin with, and could have been solved by providing for the material needs of the family. And, you know, again, thinking more broadly, having a society that doesn't have this kind of poverty that creates these needs. So I think pointing out that what's usually pointed to, which are cases of extreme abuse of children, and saying, well, what do we do about that? I mean, one answer is, okay, we'll deal with that, but can you first acknowledge that the vast majority of cases don't involve that? Okay, so now if we can acknowledge that these children are being taken away unnecessarily because the family's needs could be met in less traumatic ways, less destructive ways, and we're left with the cases of, you know, violent abuse, let's say, or extreme neglect, which may be a result of mental illness. Okay, so how are we as a society dealing with the causes of that mental illness, the way in which mental illness is treated? When it comes to violence in families, we know that the current approach has not ended violence in families. And in the US, there's evidence that for Black women in particular, law enforcement approaches make matters worse, not only because Black women are sometimes themselves arrested when they call the police, or assaulted, even killed, but also because it just doesn't stop the violence. It may stop it temporarily, but it doesn't stop it. And there are better ways of addressing it than these punitive ways of taking children away or locking people up in prison. So, and then the other thing I would say is, no one, as far as I know, is saying just dismantle everything we have and leave these families, you know, to fend for themselves, regardless of the result. I mean, in fact, what I'm advocating for, and many others, is a radical change to care more for these families. Like, we're not saying care, we're saying care more. You know, I feel it. How dare you say I'm not care? I'm the one. You're advocating for taking children away after you have shown no care for them. You want to traumatize children after you've shown no care for them. I'm advocating for radically changing our society to show generous care for these families. Please don't tell me I care less. I think I care more. And so, but let's be realistic. And you're right that when, there is a difference between having the ideal vision and figuring out how to implement it. I'm struggling through that right now in a particular project where I have been asked to recommend concrete steps regarding another issue, but related, and working, with others to do that. And boy, it's difficult. It's really difficult. But there's no, we're not saying wave a magic wand and this is going to happen tomorrow. So yes, we have to grapple with that. We don't know all the answers because we've been relying on a system that is based in a horrible, oppressive logic. So we have to figure out how are we going to do it in a way that's based on not threatening families, not accusing families, but supporting them. How are we going to do that? I have complete faith that as we move toward that, we can eliminate those horrible cases that people point to. I don't know the answer for doing it tomorrow, but I have complete faith that a society that generously cares, in humane and equitable ways for every child and every family is going to be a safer society for everybody. I have absolute faith in that. And so I'm willing to work toward that without fear that children are going to be more victimized by violence. And absolutely not. They're going to be better off than they are the way we're doing it now. And so why hold on to an approach that we know is harmful? I haven't even gotten to the harms to children who are placed in the system. I didn't even mention that yet.
No.
It's going to be a whole chapter of my next book. I haven't even mentioned that yet. But the idea that the best the opponents can say is, well, it's not as bad as you say it is, or there are these egregious, how are you going to deal with these egregious cases? I think that's pretty pathetic. If that's your objection to making radical change in a system that we know right now is harmful and unjust.
Well, Dorothy, I'd like to sum that up in a movement that I'm involved in, which is called Radical Tenderness, and that's what we're trying to promote at the heart of any system change is radical tenderness, and we're talking about that a lot.
That's much better than radical violence against the most marginalized people in society. I would prefer radical tenderness, yes. And I believe that would have much better results and outcomes than the former.
Dorothy, thank you so much. I'm just checking in with the time here, and I could go on for a lot longer. And I would hope that if we need a critical friend, that we can come back to you as we continue down this road for sure. It's been a real grounding experience. This has, in terms of standing alongside Black Lives Matter and actually making that something that is real and radical, but with the tenderness that Bev and Becca has spoken about. So I really do hope we can come back to you on this. Our view on this tonight would be we've set up some breakout groups that people might want to come into and make some views heard. And our job in that at this very early stage would be to take that work back to our regulators or education or curriculums or research agendas, and just to say this is what we would like to share with you based on this. It's not a journey we're beginning. This work has begun, but it's part of our kind of conviction in terms of taking it forward. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. It's a very humbling experience, actually. I think probably Bev and Ariane might want to say something as we leave as well. But for me, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Very welcome. Very welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say too much because I just feel like, yeah, it's a lovely ending, and yeah, it's been a really beautiful experience. And I was kind of reflecting that when I was a social work student, I'm conscious some of my students are here, and there's social work students here. 20 years ago, when I was a social work student, I wrote an essay that failed about how child protection didn't protect children. So just have faith that these things come round, don't they? And you kind of you get in a position to be able to do something about these things eventually. So yeah,
That's and changing the curriculum is important. That was something else I had on my mind. A great idea, and maybe a project you all could work on. Students would be fantastic.
Well, we know we've had some wonderful examples of students coming forward around the decolonisation of the curriculum agenda in social work, and I think that's a really powerful action that students have been leading for all of us. I just want to say thank you, if I may call you Sister Dorothy. That has just been so inspiring for me and so heartwarming, and we definitely we are going to stick together with this. You know, we've got our little selves together into this group, and we are going to try and do what we can to keep pushing out these agendas and building a coalition and building collaboration. I think it's important, as you said, that we don't all have to agree. We just have to find the things we can agree on to work together. Yeah, and that's
values. I've done work like that. That's the first thing we do. We find our shared values, work on those. Yeah,
that's right.
Well, I have one request of this group, and that is when it's safe to do so, you invite me to the UK. I'd love to come to Belfast and
definitely, definitely.
I want an invitation.
That is definitely my IOU to you. If you want to come to Belfast, you can write me an IOU, and I'll play that one out for sure.
or a tour. I don't want to pick just one city. Of the British Isles.
We'll have to pass you around the 5 nations.
Your academic presence here, with no doubt. With all of us will welcome your academic presence here and your presence here. Fantastic. Let's pray for that day.
So we can all meet in person. Okay, well, I'm going to sign out, and thanks again. It was an honor and inspiration to meet with all of you. And just thanks again for the chance to talk with you about my book. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dorothy. All the very best.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye.
thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye. Oh, gosh. Going to go into the room now, is it, Amanda? Go into the room.
Laura, would you like to sort of take over if anybody would like to jump in and come into one of the groups with us just to get a few notes? It won't take a long time, but I think it'd be really useful if people are still around just to capture some ideas. You can go into the education group with me. Ariane will be in the research group. Bev will be in the practice group with Jen. Caroline's going to go in with Ariane, and I'll be in the education group with Zoo. And it's just a short kind of, give us a few comments to help us take this forward, to get it back to the regulators, to get it back to social work education. All you need to do is click on one of the links that's in the chat box at the moment, and just join the group. That's right, Laura? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so those rooms are live now, and you just need to click into it. You'll leave this this main meeting room, and you'll maybe have a chance to talk in smaller groups. So
I'll nip off into the education one then. Thanks, Laura.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. See some of you in research.
Sorry, I'm being a bit slow here. It's Claudia. How do you get into the rooms, the breakout rooms?
If you go into the chat area, and
I'm in the chat. Yeah.
All you need to do is click on the purple join Teams meeting link for the relevant group. So if you hover over and just click on one of those, then that will bring you into a different virtual room, and you'll leave this room, but you'll go into whatever room you want to, if that's clear.
I think so.